Dennis Voznesenski from Rabobank. Always a pleasure to have you with us on Flow, Dennis.
G'day, Ricky.
The Ukraine conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the broader possible Eastern Europe conflict has a lot of concerns, export problems from the Black Sea. What are we seeing, first of all, when it comes to grains, especially wheat, to start off with?
So for wheat, since, and I use this as a reference point, the 21st of February, just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, prices are up around 45%. That's Chicago Board of Trade prices. Here locally, if you look at Adelaide, up around 8%. So again, not as high as what's happening overseas, just because we had that massive crop here and we're struggling to get it out of our ports. We're just at capacity at the moment.
Yeah, that was actually mentioned. We got a mention in the Wall Street Journal in a piece that was published overnight saying, look, people are starting to look to Australia, but we've got export constraints in terms of getting the food to where it's needed, as they speculated in America about a global food crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So we have the grain here. We want to get it out as fast as we can, but our port facilities simply aren't built to get a crop of that size out so quickly. But we're already hearing a lot of grain logistics companies trying to add a little bit of capacity here and there. Of course, that won't do anything like double it or even increase it by 50%, of course, because to do that, you need to build a new port facility. And knowing Australia, by the time you build a new port facility, we're likely in a year where we don't have as much crop. So I would assume a lot of companies would be hesitant to build something structural. So like a new port facility to deal with this, with these supply issues.
Yeah, we'd been picking up there was some sort of exploration of some sort of temporary scenarios. I've got mental images of excavators lifting it out of trucks into barges or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's the sort of thing. That's the sort of thing logistics companies are doing, or the grain merchants are doing. You got to remember, when there is a premium to be made, and right now overseas prices are considerably higher than Australia. When there's that premium to be made, it starts becoming viable to use methods of getting grain onto ships that you typically wouldn't use because they're too expensive. Now they become viable, and in whatever form they will look like, the grain traders will pursue those new options that are typically more expensive.
All right, well, that's talking generally about wheat. Has there been some upside about this whole conflict when it comes to barley?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So when the anti-dumping tariffs came onto Australian barley, and I know there's not a lot of sorghum grown in South Australia, obviously, but if we look at what was happening in, for example, Newcastle Port, the price of sorghum went significantly above barley because those same Chinese traders who were buying Australian feed barley now couldn't do that and had to buy sorghum, and the price of sorghum went up. Now, though, you're seeing that premium decline, not to zero yet, but you're seeing over the last, month, couple of weeks, that premium sharply decline. And we're also actually hearing from China that the likelihood of them coming back is increasing by the day. And the reason is there's only so many places in the world you can get malt or feed barley. There's Canada, which had historic drought last year. There's Europe, which had 2 below average crops in a row. And then there was Ukraine, so the Black Sea. And now you can't get anything out of Ukraine whatsoever. So there's the likelihood of them coming back is now higher than the likelihood of them not coming back for Australian barley, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, but I wonder that's not going to see them just sort of fold at the World Trade Organization and say we did the wrong thing. They're going to maybe look the other way as things are moved through particular ports, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I wouldn't expect that they would come back and say we're lifting anti-dumping tariffs. I would assume they would quietly start importing Australian barley.
Right. Now, I know canola, there's a decent amount that's grown in the Black Sea region. It's not as big a contributor from memory to the global picture, but still it's a significant shortage in the market on the canola side.
Yeah, so Ukraine and Russia together account, depending on the year, because it depends on how good their production is, but anywhere from 16 to 23% of global canola exports. So it goes, Canada's the biggest, then we go to Australia, a second biggest exporter, and then we go to Ukraine. It is a big issue if this conflict stretches out further. At the moment, there's not that much canola left in Ukraine, but what there is a lot left is sunflower oil. And if they can't get that out of the country, it, of course, pushes up the price of canola too.
Now, my mind actually turns, talking about canola, we've often touched on not ethanol, biodiesel or mandates in North America for that sort of thing. We see the Qatar Australia Party, as the fuel prices go up, talking up ethanol, which I think is sugarcane product. Is there a chance with fuel prices where they are that we might see these sorts of mandates suddenly back in vogue and an increased demand for canola?
Well, it's an interesting one. Let's go to global and then Australia. So globally, again, like you mentioned, in the Northern Hemisphere, there's all these biofuel policies. The governments there want to use more biofuels because it reduces the emissions of fuel. And at the moment, we're actually seeing, for example, President Biden say, well, if food prices are going to go up, maybe we shouldn't be burning vegetable oils in fuel, and hence they might actually draw back some of those policies, or at least push them back to a later date. In Australia, there's been talk about producing biofuels and then even exporting them, because to make an operation viable, we have to rely on the global market. The Australian market's simply too small. But the problem with that is we've seen countries in the past who built biofuel facilities to then export whatever biofuel that may be. Is it ethanol, biodiesel? We've seen those exports actually be met by export barriers. So, for example, maybe we think we could start producing biodiesel here or ethanol and exporting it, but we might quickly find out that the countries who we want to export to go, you know what, we have our own industry, we want to protect it, so we're not going to allow your imports. And that's kind of one of the barriers, the theoretical barriers to building more facilities here and then trying to export that stuff.
Well, speaking of building facilities, there was a big recent announcement by the federal government putting about $130 million or more into developing plant proteins, which was met with some excitement by those that are on the pulses side of the equation, as there's more attraction to non-meat protein. I don't imagine that's had a spike in that market just yet, but the prices there have been running pretty well already anyway.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We did a report in late 2020 on plant-based meat substitutes in a couple of key regions around the world. And for Australia, the market domestically is quite small, so there's not too many opportunities there. But the opportunities for those producers here in Australia are then to get those pulses, process them into plant protein, and then when they're in those products, export them to overseas markets. So, for example, Asia, where demand is really rising quite significantly. So as those facilities are built that you mentioned, as we start moving into the future and that demand rises overseas, that could be a very lucrative operation where we'll be able to take the pulses here instead of exporting them raw, process them. That adds to jobs, and then export the actual pulse proteins into overseas markets, or make those food products here, those plant-based meat substitute food products, we see in Coles and Woolies, export those overseas too.
Now, Dennis, I know you're touring the regions and talking about things like wool as well. Where are you visiting soon, and how might people find out more about what you got to say about commodities?
Well, we're actually heading to Burrawa this Friday in New South Wales, and we're going to be chatting about wool. And you can actually catch me on Twitter, where I commonly post updates, at Voz_Dennis.
That's at Voz with a Z, V-O-Z.
Yeah, that's right, Voz_Dennis.
Yep, no worries. Dennis, thanks for joining us. Always a pleasure to get your views on what's happening on multiple markets. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Thanks, Ricky.